So at this time, I'd like to introduce the HPNA Director of Professional Practice, Connie Dahlin. Connie is a longtime HPNA member, supporter, board member. I think every position that HPNA has, she has been a part of. So at no further ado, I was going to say doctor, but Director of Professional Practice, Connie Dahlin.
Great, thank you. So good morning, everyone. It's always really nice to come to Leadership Weekend. I think for me, the interesting part is like the intimacy, because when we're at annual assembly and we're all spread out all over, we're at Clinical Practice Forum, and then I'm probably more in charge of that because this is Chad gets to be responsible, so I don't get to see as many of you. And so I think what I would like to do today is to really have us thinking about nursing leadership. And particularly in palliative care, obviously, because you're here. And so I think, when you think about leadership, some of us have gotten a little bit afraid. But something really important happened this week for me. We were on a conversation with the American Nurses Association. Many of you may know we're working with them on a professional issues panel for hospice and palliative care. And we're trying to sort of think about how to galvanize palliative nursing and get it into the forefront. And so we were talking about statistics. And so what came out of it was saying, okay, who are we speaking to? How many nurses do we have in this country? And where are they? So how many nurses do you think we have in this country? 3 million, okay, somebody cheated. That's about the amount that we have. How many doctors do you think we have? There are only about 500,000 doctors. Now, I was surprised at that number, but that speaks to the sense that, you think about us as the profession. We are the largest healthcare profession. And so 3 million seems sort of low to me, honestly. But I think, I'm not quite sure if that was only 3 million RNs, if it's 3 million of everybody or not. And so why is that important? Well, we have a great chance to be leading things in many areas. And so we've got to think about how do we take this opportunity. So how many of you all think of yourselves as leaders? Okay, by the time you leave my session, all of you are going to think that you're leaders, okay? Because I think this is this sense about what do we think about leadership and where do we fit in that role. The other part of this is that, very interestingly, how many of you had a leadership course when you were in nursing school? Wow, okay, that's more than I thought. Because I know most of us, when we sort of became in practice, we may have done something depending on what our role was. I know that as an advanced practice, we had to do some leadership development, but not that much. And so, then we come out and we're sort of expected to be doing things, but we've never been taught the skills to do that. And then if you were to go online and you look at leadership for nursing and you look at leadership for physicians, it's very skewed in terms of the opportunities. And that, I think, is really unfortunate. And so I just had this conversation with somebody about they had no clue that as nurses, the opportunities for us were as limited as they were. So where do I want to take you today? We have the Leadership Position Statement, which we will use. But what I really wanted to tell you also is that I have no real or perceived conflicts of interests. I always try to think about what those would be these days. And then what I really wanted to think about leadership for the palliative care nurse and thinking about leadership across our settings and looking at the spheres of clinical care administration, research, education, and policy and advocacy. And why am I framing it that way? Because I think sometimes when we are thinking about leadership, we automatically go to administration. Oh, I'm not a leader because I'm not a manager. Well, that's only one part of leadership. There's many other things that leaders can do. So when you think about nursing, we have the potential, because remember, we are the most trusted health profession. That, in this day and age, considering the political climate, is not something that we should take lightly. We need to really use that and think about how do we use the trust that we've garnered to be using it in public health, to be using it in education, to be using it in our care, to be thinking about the future in terms of the nursing profession and really bringing people in and really thinking about it in every day. How are we leading? And I think we are, but sometimes we don't give ourselves credit for that. So, well, here's what I want you to do for a second of thinking about where you are, what you practice, and I say practice liberally. Practice in administration, practice in clinical, practice in research. Tell me which of these characteristics right now, and you might have been inspired by Brenda, so you're probably a little more positive than you would have been an hour or so ago. But I'm thinking about which of these do you have right now? So take a minute and write down which of these you have. So, positive attitude, that's the sense that no matter how hard things are getting, you still are able to kind of say, I'm doing some good stuff here. How many of you feel like you have a positive attitude? Okay. Healthy relationships. This one is really important because we get into this work. We do really hard work. We sometimes can let our family and friends go. How many of us are really still attending to our healthy relationships? Okay, and this one's a hard work, right? Because you got to do that work-life separation. Belief in palliative nursing or work as a palliative care nurse. I hope every single one of you have that one. Okay. All right. Belief in your colleagues. This one's hard sometimes, right? Because sometimes you sort of feel like, gosh, if I did it myself, it would take less time, right? But that's part of the issue that we've got to, let other people do it their way and also let them learn. And part of learning is failing. And we particularly, as women, but also as nurses, so my apologies to men in the room, you probably have it better off, but we get into this part about we should do it the best way possible, and if we fail, that's really bad, rather than failure, we all are going to have failed. I mean, when we all started to walk, we fell down many times, right, until we figured out how to master that and sort of figuring out our language and all of that. But somehow we really have taken in our society that failure is bad. And I think, again, if you look at our political climate right now, failure is bad. So we have to kind of reverse that and be more positive. Patience with others. How many of you put that one up there? Okay. And I can understand where the patience, right? Because you're just trying to get it done. You're just trying to get through the day. You're just trying to make sure that you get that, and you get all these different roadblocks, and by the end of the day, you're just like, ugh. Consistency with others. How many of you felt like you were this? Okay. This one's a tough one, because this also means you've got to take care of yourself so that you're in a good spot to be consistent with others. And you've got to pay attention to your relationships, because with some people you might click with better and some people not, just the same way you do with your patients. Empowering others. Okay. And this one's really important for nursing, because we sometimes get into this place that we're sort of like, well, we're nurses, we can't do this. If we come from that place of not being empowered, we can't do anything. We are nurses, we have trust, and sometimes there's a really good place of organically coming up to be able to do things and really questioning the hierarchy. So be careful when you fall into this sense of, well, that's how we've always done it. That doesn't mean that's the status quo. Healthcare is changing too much. And as nurses, that if we start saying, oh, well, we only have this scope of practice, well, then we're limiting ourselves from the very get-go. And I really think that this is when you operate from the principle of asking forgiveness rather than asking permission. Because if you ask permission, what's going to happen? No. If you do it and somebody said, you shouldn't have done that, oh, I'm really sorry, I was trying to do X, Y, and Z, let's talk about it. Right? I mean, all of hospice and palliative care is gray, and it's all about trying to figure it out, right? So that we should really be sort of thinking about the spirit of the law rather than always the letter of the law, except for when you get into certain places. So, person-centeredness, how many of you put that one up? Okay, so that one we've got to kind of really think about. If we're having a hard time, we got to take it back to the patient and take it back to the care, because that will always ground us, because sometimes we get so up here and we can't see the application. Frontline engagement. How many of you feel like you really have a sense of what's going on in the front line? That's really important, right? That's why, sometimes people ask me what I do, and I do remind them, I practice clinically. I'm still in clinical practice, and the reason I do that is because I still need to have that patient engagement and to remember what it is that I'm doing and why. And so I don't ever want to lose that. Relentless focus. Now, some of you may say this is type A. But I think of what's your personal goal, and then what's your goal for your vision for where your organization is. And that one's really important, that you stay vision. And this is this hard part that we think that if we say no, it means we're a bad person. But in fact, if you're going to really do good care and really kind of think about where you're moving things, you are laser sharp, that you stick with one thing and you do it well, and you don't kind of do too many things in a mediocre way. And, as hospice and palliative care people, we don't like to say no. But I would say to you this thing, particularly as a leader. Once you make an exception, you set a precedent, because people will know you break the rules. So be very careful, because once you make an exception for a patient, for a family, for a colleague, for an employee, you actually have now said this is what we're going to do. And you can't take that genie out of the bottle. So we've got to kind of think about our focus and be okay about saying no. Transparent. In this day and age, okay, I'm glad. Because when I've gone to some state hospice and palliative care organization meetings, and you watch people around the table, now, mind you, I'm from Massachusetts. We do not have certificate of need. So in my tiny little state, there are 70 or 80 hospices. Can you imagine, do you think an honest conversation takes place? Because they're all competing like crazy to stay alive. And so the finances part. And so it's just like, okay, we have to pick something that's really neutral to be able to talk about, which is kind of sad. So you've got to think about the transparency and where people are at. But there's a lot of agendas. If you're working in an academic part, I am learning by convening the graduate nursing faculty. The reason why I'm able to convene it, mind you, I do not have my doctorate. So Chad was being polite when he said doctor. But I'm neutral for them. From HPNA, I'm neutral. I'm not from any university. So I can be transparent with them and say, I have no agenda. I'm just trying to get you guys to talk. And they're like, well, thank you, because if you were part of a university, then we couldn't meet. Okay. So that's academia. But hospitals are like that too, in terms of collaborations and things like that. And then working across boundaries. How many of you raised your hand for that? So that's the sense of thinking about, as we move into the future, we've got to think about partnerships and collaborations. We can't do it all by ourselves. And so who are going to be with us and work with us, and who are sort of thinking about that? So when you wrote these down, how many of you had 5 or more? Okay, 10 or more? Okay, you're doing really well. Did anybody have all of these? Okay. So you now need to talk to her. I'll turn the rest of the conversation over to her. But these are some things to think about with leadership, about how do we move forward, and what are some of these things. Because if we're not positive, or we're not kind of believing in others, we convey that, and then we're not going to have people who want to work with us. So here's the self-assessment of you that I also want to do, particularly now you also listen to Brenda. I want you to take 5 minutes and think, what do you love about being a hospice and palliative nurse? How and in what way do you do your best work? So in kind of what of these arenas? Given your passion, how can you really contribute to the profession? And that doesn't have to be at a national level. That can be a local level, be in your institutional level. And then the last one is, given your strengths, how can you contribute to your chapter, your SIG, your district, or whatever, okay? So take 5 minutes and answer those. And if you have a hard time, you can talk to the person next to you. So the first one, I hope you were able to answer with some ease. Because if not, then I worry. So what are some of the things that people love about being a hospice and palliative nurse?
Okay. I think for me it's the relationships that I develop with my patients and families, and getting that trust that you develop over time, and being able to promote and really work with people at end of life.
That's good.
I love that I'm capable of being strong when the family's at their hardest time. And I feel that when I come in, I provide peace and comfort. And I mean, that's why I do this.
Good. Somebody else? Yep.
Being able to give the patient and the family the tools they need so that they can be the ones that are the leaders in taking care of their loved ones. And when their loved one passes away, there's no regrets because they have done it. They have been the person that comforted and took care of their loved one, which was the goal all along.
Great. Anybody else?
I think being able to bring the art of the nursing profession into the IDT to make it a part of the entire care for the patient.
Nice. Anybody else?
I think that it's understanding myself more. So aside from all the other things which I agree with, but also understanding and connecting with humanity with the other person.
Yeah.
In my younger days, I was a firefighter and a medic, and I always felt like I got to help people in a big way. So this is a new way of helping people in a big way. They're scared about what they don't know because they didn't plan to die. They didn't think about dying. They didn't have open conversations about dying. And information is power, and so it's empowering them.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah.
I provide palliative care to my heart failure patients, but I'm not a hospice or palliative care nurse. But I am, but I'm not, if you know what I mean.
We have to change your view of that.
No, I have the view, but if you were to go to my work, they would say,
Okay.
Nora's a telehealth nurse, not a palliative care nurse. But what I love about the HPNA and all of the folks that I've met since since hearing about all of you is the language around it, so that when those folks say, you're not palliative care, I can say, yes, I am, and this is what my patients love and need, as well as their families. So I love the language. I love it all. Thanks.
Good. So what's really interesting about that is, so when you think about that, in order to be a leader, you've got to love what you do. And all of us, you all were nodding when different people were talking, and so we do have a shared common language, and I would also say a shared heart about this work, or we wouldn't be in it, right? So when you think about, like, where is your best work, how many of you said clinical? Okay. How many of you said administration? Okay, so that's in the sense of how many of you feel like administration. How many of you are interested in quality insurance? I love you guys because that's not my expertise. Okay. Education, how many of you? All right, so that's another popular one. Research, okay. And then policy. Good for you, Karen. So, it's interesting of thinking about, the popular places are clinical and education, but yet we need leaders in all of these because we need all of these parts of nursing. And as a leader, we don't have to be comfortable with all of these, but we certainly need to understand what the difference in all of them is, and sort of then knowing where we can get that. And then thinking about your passion, what are the best ways that you guys think that you can contribute? What were some of the things that people brought up? Yep.
Mentoring the next generation up.
That's a big one. We had, I was really excited to talk about, she said mentoring the next generation. And last night at some of the table, we were talking a little bit about generational differences of people coming into this work, also thinking about those of us who've been in it and how things are changing, and we need to have people who are coming from ground up to kind of create their new future as well. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm an adjunct professor at Northwest Florida State College, and they have an RN program, and they have an RN to BSN, and I did teach in the RN to BSN. It was all online, and I taught sort of like some clinical simulation and some other things as a nurse practitioner. But I'm just sitting here, and I thought, my gosh, I could start an elective of hospice and palliative care nursing in those programs. Like, why did I think that?
Okay. So what you actually just saw, that's an example of leadership, right? That percolate an idea and to take that to the part of like, how do you enact it? Because it's not okay if we just do the leader for us. Leadership is about other people. Other people have comments about that?
For me, my passion is the advocacy piece of it, and I feel like that's probably, I'm on the advocacy council, but we have to speak for our profession. Otherwise, we have people making decisions for us that don't know our business, and so it's up to us to be there and kind of provide the education and the information that they need to make an informed decision.
And this one is really, really important. So, you know, when you get your letters from people and they say, please click on and do that to your thing, it takes you a minute. But she's right. What's really happened, there have been a couple meetings, major meetings, that you would have assumed that we as nursing would have been at the table, but there was no mention of us. And so we can't wait to be invited. We can't expect that anybody will represent us. And in fact, we don't want them to represent us, right? Because that always makes it a challenge. So really kind of thinking about how do we advocate for ourselves. You know, we can't kind of sit there anymore and kind of say, oh, well, we'll just see if somebody else mentions it, because it won't happen that way. What else in terms of where people are at, whether to, yep. Oh, this is Denise. Okay, this will be interesting.
This kind of goes with mentoring the next generation, but for me, it's about calling it out when we see it. So I work with a lot of nurses who don't self-identify as palliative care nurses, but I have this thing that I just caught you doing palliative care. And so it's really, and they go, oh, you did catch me doing palliative care. And so I just think we need to start calling it out and make it obvious. And
yeah. So maybe we need to like give the palliative, so whoever brought the chocolates out there, thank you. I'm very grateful. That's a leadership issue for me, because a day without chocolate is a day without sunshine. So, but, you know, if like, you know, giving that little prize, like, hey, you just did a palliative care moment. Bing! And you give like, and see how many chocolates people have. You know, and then we could have little sayings on the inside. Palliative care, it's not just for end of life, you know. So somebody can market that, okay? So what else are people thinking in terms of where passion's going to guide them? All right, then we're going to move on to the next question. I don't need this. Given your strengths, how can you contribute to what your organizations are doing, whether it's your chapter or your SIGs or anything else? Yep.
So I kind of made a,
Did it go off?
I kind of,
Oops, she has a better one then.
I kind of made a connection between 2, 3, and 4. In that, I think it's one of my strengths is being able to, and somebody, this is not my own statement, this is somebody else's statement, but bring the bedside into the boardroom.
Yeah.
And truly narrow the degrees of separation between the clinical and that policy place, and everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
Really making that connection.
So that connection between the boardroom and the bedroom. Wait, I shouldn't say it that way. How you said it better? What did you say? The bedside. Sorry. Whew. I think some people have gotten in trouble for that. That's not a leadership skill we want to include. But you know, I think I used to work with a physician who would say in a meeting, "I don't understand what nurses would do." And I would like, you know, part of me was just like, Dilbert must control hand of death. And the second part of me, like, it's okay to think that, but you're saying this publicly in a meeting with the hospital? What are you thinking? Those are those little bubbles. And so, you know, that sense of exactly what do nurses do at the bedside? And I think as much as possible, if you are struggling, this is when you get creative. It's really okay, you can get permission to do this, because some people have said, oh my goodness. Start having your chief financial officer follow a nurse for the day. Have the business manager do some conversations, because, you know, for them it's very theoretical. But when they're sitting in the room with you, and it might be like one of the most comfortable conversations you've had because it's not a difficult family, whatever, they're having a panic attack because you're using the H word, hospice, you're using the P word, and you almost might bring up the D word. And so by the time you walk out, they're like, okay, I'll give you what you want. Because they finally have realized what we do, right? So those are some of those things about exactly bringing those people together and having board members do that. And also, never underestimate you as a nurse sitting on those boards. We need to have more nursing presence on those boards. So that's a great point, James.
And also letting your team know that you're doing it.
Yes.
Making those connections with them. Because there's very often people on the team who feel like their message is not being heard. Their administration is such that there is that block.
So that goes back to the principle of being transparent about why you're doing it and what you're doing. And so that's that point of saying, you may think that I'm going to the board meetings because I'm trying to get out of work. In fact, they're incredibly stressful, and I'm really trying to represent our voice and have a conversation. So this is not, this is really a reason behind that. Other things that people thought of? Yeah.
So it's kind of similar. I feel pretty comfortable in multiple areas, and what I think I bring now is more of a ability to think outside of the box, look at things
See
a
if it
little
works.
broader.
Yeah, see if it works. I don't know what's going on.
Can you hear me? No.
Check 1 2. Check 1 2.
Okay. All right. So I was saying that I feel pretty comfortable in multiple areas because I've been doing it a while. But I think what people tell me is that I'm good at thinking outside of the box. I'm good at inspiring people and taking the message where somebody can relate the message, but they don't really feel inspired or empowered to do it. So it's exciting time to be able to say, I have done this, and I can bring that voice to other areas, whether it's the board or whether it's going out in the community and talking to them about a new thing.
Mm-hmm. And so that's that creativity part. Yep.
I just wanted to add to the idea of the boardroom and being represented. One of the things that I have done in the last few years is really work with policy. I've been out visiting all my legislature people. I've had them come to the nursing home and see what I do and establish relationships with candidates and people that are already representatives. And I think that is a huge thing that nurses can do to promote things that we need.
And this is, you don't have to do it alone. So to that, you could work with the American Cancer Society, who usually has a lobby day state by state. And I did that a couple of years ago, and they were kind of amused because I said, man, I'm really nervous about going into them. And they said, here's your packet, here's your delivery, going knocking on the door. Of course, I didn't meet any of the legislators themselves. I got to meet the aides, but that was okay. The aides had to endure me. And, it was interesting of sort of thinking about the questions and sort of thinking how they were going to frame that. So, there's a lot of ways from the boardroom but then you also can think about, clinical meetings. You can think about when you have the medical therapeutics meetings. All of those places are all places that you can think about for leadership. So let's think about a little bit about, so you don't work by yourself because remember you're with a team. So it's also important to think about how people perceive you, because in order to be a good leader, you have to have a sense of that. So take a few minutes and sort of write down, how do you think your team perceives you? And if you have no idea, this is your homework to go back and ask them. Do you think people trust you? Why or why not? Are you able to develop caring, trusting relationships with your employees? Why or why not? And do you think people want to work with you? And if they've had to, would they choose to again? That's always a difficult one. And then do you have a sense of what it's like to work with you? And you're not allowed to ask Julie what it's like to work with me. All right, so take a few minutes to think about those questions. Do you think these questions are hard? Yeah?
In a way.
Which one?
In a way.
In a way? Okay. I think this is the reason why I gave you this is that sometimes we have a sense of what we'd like to be, but we don't have a sense of what people perceive from us. And so it's really important that people kind of have a sense of that. You know, so if I were to take my own self, I know that since I'm from New England, I sometimes talk a little fast and I'm a tad direct. So I know that for some people, when I work with them, they might be intimidated by that. And so I have to be very aware of that. But also sort of thinking about, you know, this trusting part. So, you know, you may not be able to answer these questions now, but this would be something that, again, is your homework to go home and sort of think about it and maybe ask a couple people to give you feedback. Now, this is the interesting part. You've got to say to them, don't just say it's fine. Fine doesn't help us, right? And also, fine doesn't help us improve. And so part of it is also thinking about, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and so you probably can look around your organization and see who are really great managers, who are great leaders. Like Peg was talking about, there's a difference between management, when you're kind of working with a program, versus a leader or a visionary person. You also have people who are really good at kind of keeping everything in control. So you really want to think about that, and then this trust part, what's the perception? And I think one of the things that I think last year was when we talked about leadership that I thought has been very poignant with me and stuck with me, so this is why we really appreciate your feedback, is a lot of people were saying they need to see leaders in people who are similar to them in similar positions and all of that. And so I think that, you know, that's something we're taking to heart. We're going to develop a leadership design of novice to expert, what it means to be a leader at different levels, and what are the types of things that we should do. And then this whole part about, do people want to work with you again? You want to know that, because if you traumatize them so much, you know, they might not want to work with you, or if you make it fun or engaging or things like that. So think about that on your way home. The other thing that you need to think about is when you're working in terms of leadership, even if you're in administration or not, who do you have relationships with? If you don't know your chief nursing officer in your organization, no matter what position, that's a problem. Because exactly what you were saying is they need to know what's happening at the bedside. So sort of talking to them when you have, you know, holiday parties or they're doing nursing leadership. What? Turn it on. There we go. Thank you. Technical difficulties. They need to know what you're doing. You know, the CEO sometimes needs to see that. The chief financial officer, chief operating officer, and physicians, ED. So all those people need to know what you're doing in your role. Whether you're in the hospital, in the nursing home, in the home, all of those places. And then thinking about if what you were sort of saying in heart failure, you're actually leading hospice and palliative care in a very subtle way. They don't perceive you as palliative care, but you're sort of infiltrating concepts. That's a great way of leadership. They don't feel like we're hitting them over the head, but you're sort of saying, this is how we want to take care of better patients. And then thinking about, you know, effective and leading an effort. You know, it's not enough for heart anymore. As you all know, this is an environment of finances. So you've got to know who's financially supporting you to do what. Because if you started something without any funding, then they think that you can continue to do it for free. Budget gets tight. What's going to happen to what you're doing? Bye-bye. So I know as nurses, we haven't ever thought about that, but I've had people who started palliative care programs when I said, so who oversees your program? They can't answer me. I'm like, so who takes care of your budget? Well, I had this person, but they left, but they still told me they believed in it. I said, so who's gone over a budget and a plan with you? That hasn't happened. Her program was gone within a year because there was never any home for it or any financial basis for it. So you've also got to think about you know, time, money, that we do things that are worth it, and so that it's okay to kind of think in that realm. And thinking about also where you work, what's a better way to provide care or change care? You know, thinking about eliciting patient choices. Where I'm up at Massachusetts, it's a very interesting phenomenon that's happening. When you turn 50, people get their AARP information, and then they get their advanced care planning packet. I don't know what the message is there because I thought 50 was the new 30, but that's how they're starting the conversation, right? Thinking about pain and symptom management. We just had the CDC come in with the new guidelines for opioids. I don't know about you, I'm terrified about that because I think it's going to be much more restrictive. But we've got to be part of that solution to say for hospice and palliative patients, we as nurses know that these patients are in pain. We're going to tell you the types of medications we need to be able to work with. We're not going to let our patients suffer from this. So that's a huge voice. Thinking to grief and bereavement needs of patient, family, and staff. We have a lot of people on staff who are walking wounded. We don't attend to them because, quote, sitting in a support meeting means that they're losing time, except for when you reframe it for people that by having a support meeting means you retain these people and then you don't have to pay the sometimes $30,000 or $40,000 orientation fee to get somebody new. It's actually worth it to have that support bereavement meeting. So you've really got to think about it in these cost types of things to help people think about the overall outcomes of that. Spiritual needs, this whole part about where are we at? Now, the interesting part about that is there are studies in our country that show that 50% of people are unchurched. Now, you need to know what region you're from as to whether that exists or not in your region. But that's a huge thing because we haven't paid attention to that. We have religion, we have spirituality, and then what do we do with that? But this is a huge part about how people are coping with a lot. And I will just say that I'm kind of worried right now because the negativity and the conflict that's going on makes me feel like we don't have a place of having civil discourse anymore. And in palliative care, we've always tried to do that as we've dealt with end of life and palliative sedation or advanced care planning being called death panels. And so, we have to kind of think about that. Thinking about working with others, that's how you have to be successful. You can't be a one-person show or you won't be able to do anything. And so you need to think about who are the people that you can work with. Sometimes it's unlikely partners. In some of the work that we're doing with this rural and frontier work, we had a nurse practitioner who's in the middle of rural Virginia. Her partner is the funeral home to do grief and bereavement. There are no other clinicians in her little town of 100. And in another town, it was the EMS because they were the other person who understood the crisis and they were the people who were getting calls when people fell and did that. So you've got to kind of think about sometimes who these partners are not going to be the classic partners. And that's part of leadership of sort of saying, who wants to do this? That's not who I thought would sit at the table with me. And then a team in place who can help you think about some of these things. So the other part that people miss is like a team evaluation. This is really critical in this time of what's your mission and vision. I know people hate that, but if somebody's created a mission and vision for a marketing brochure and your team hasn't bought into it, then nobody's going to feel like they're part of that. That was just sort of made up. And I could tell you this with a team that we started with one of the hospitals that I was at. I kept saying, you know what, I know this is mundane, but we got to have this conversation. Well, we didn't do it, and we didn't do it, and we didn't do it, and we had a lovely brochure. And then 5 years later, we still had to do it. And it was the thing that shaped what we did, because if it didn't fall in our mission and vision, we could easily say the word no, right? And you've got to be able to say no. And so really thinking about that. What is hospice and palliative care in your institution? How well do you know the team? How do you know your team and strengths and weaknesses and honor that? You're going to have some people who are nurturers, some people who are leaders, some people information sharers. Commitment to healthy team building. This time and place where people say, oh, we can do everything by telehealth and do it by connection. You've got to have something grounded where people see people face to face. We know that. But remember, the younger generation, that's not their value. And so they don't think it's important, except for when you're doing this work, you've got to have some connection to have some of these conversations. And so, how do we bring them in to say that that is really important to spend time, even if it's once a year, at some sort of retreat or some sort of happy gathering that we can get and talk to that. And then people seeing that they're vital. If they don't feel important, they're not going to stay with you. So maybe part of your role is you're the team builder part in your team, and you're the one who helps keep everybody together so that they feel recognized and honoring when they do good things. And thinking about how prepared are you. None of us get that much training. I started doing things because it's just like, oh, this sounds interesting, and I bopped around. I never had formal leadership training. So, thinking about that. And then also thinking about your team meetings, whether you're doing them by IT or in person, how often. And then what's the process for that? Because you should also have a structure for that so everybody knows that. So when you think about leadership, leadership is really this process of social influence where we're kind of bringing people together for a common goal. It's not that sophisticated. And so that's why when you think about what leadership is, you don't have to be a CEO. You don't have to be a manager in that formal type. You're doing leadership when you're bringing people to do policies and procedures together. You're bringing people together when you're trying to think about your team dynamics and look at job descriptions. You're bringing people together when you're trying to think about what patients should we be targeting and what ones should we not. All of that is about leadership. It's just different parts of what you're doing to think about bringing people together to achieve something. So when you break it down like that, that's not that difficult, right? It's sort of thinking about what you're interested in, where you're going to move. I liked this comment by Florence Wald, saying leaders must be open to the conversation around controversy. Now, she started hospice. I was just at a dinner the other night. We have some new NP fellows in Boston, and my colleague Maureen Lynch said, so tell us about the history of palliative care and hospice. Now, these are nurses, and they said, Cicely Saunders. And we both looked at each other, and we know each other really well, and Maureen was really gentle. She said, let's go back a little bit further than her. Let's think about where this started, and let's think about who are the nursing people. And she couldn't name nursing people. We were like, Florence Nightingale, that was all about hospice and palliative care. Claire Barton, that was all about hospice and palliative care. Florence Wald. So, also of reminding people that we've had nursing leaders who've been doing this for a long time, and that if you look at interdisciplinary, it wasn't only Cicely, it wasn't some of the other people, that there have been some very strong people. So we have to remind people of the history and the process. So I also thought this was really interesting, remembering your roots in terms of the way that we're socialized. We've sort of been socialized, stay objective, don't get too close, don't share yourself, be professional, whatever that means. Yet some nurses are willing to enter the world of suffering, and they lead the way. This is what we're doing every day in hospice and palliative care. They've heard the cries of pain and acknowledged the person beyond the pain. So I think that kind of speaks to me in terms of what keeps me going. That we are entering this space of suffering. And you all know this. You go to the party and you tell people what you do. And what are the two responses you get? I can't do that. Or what's the other response? Let me tell you about, right? So in my household, my husband and my children have set a rule for me that when we go to parties, I'm not allowed to say what I do. Which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't, because sometimes I'll be really vague and I'll say, where do you work? I work next to a shore hospital. Oh, what do you do? I'm a nurse practitioner. Oh, where do you office? Oh, I'm all around the hospital. And then finally, after about 10 questions, I do palliative care, and they're like, oh. And then my husband just watched. He's like, can't you just tell him you're an accountant? So, you got to think about that, but I think that's the whole part. So in the sense of who are the palliative nurse leaders? Do you know what the answer to the question is? Yeah, all of us. So all the LPNs, RNs, APRNs. And thinking about where we move with this, you have this position statement. So if you haven't read it, you got it twice in your packet. I think it was so if you missed it the first time, you're making an impression. You get it a second time. But read it over, because it might have some ideas for you. It might have some thoughts for you. We've broken it out in the different realms about what examples are in the different domains. And I think in terms of palliative nursing, that we're really in the process of empowering patients, nurses, and colleagues, because we're really transforming the care and culture of serious illness. And that's really the essence, and that's what helps us be leaders and helps us kind of think of our vision and mission. So some of the other areas just to think about is person-centeredness, frontline engagement. This is this authenticity piece, which we're hearing about in a lot of ways. But person-centeredness, I think we've really gotten down. We know it's the patient and family, and if we have forgotten, we can borrow from PEDS because they do it best. This focus of really how are we going to push this forward, this transparency and this boundaryless that we're really looking about beyond the box and looking at the vision. And then thinking about with the team, how do we appreciate others, honor and respect what they do? How do we affiliate with others, even if our views and cultures different? Thinking about autonomy, how do we make decisions and have them respected? thinking about our status, that we recognize everybody's contribution to the team. And if you really want to think about this, this one is when you have your team meetings, change up the process. Have different disciplines lead it, and have them lead it as how they would start a meeting. So social work usually starts with the social history first and gets to the medical diagnosis later on. The spiritual care people might really talk about their religious journey and all of that. We know how the docs will do it, and we've sort of fallen in between. But when you do it that way and rotate it, it reminds people that you have different people from the team at the table and that their perspectives are different. And then thinking this role. If you are unclear about your role, there's good reason. We one point mapped out the team part. And what's different about hospice and palliative care from a lot of other specialties is we overlap so much more. And remember, we've been doing this for a long time, and the dirty little secret is that the physicians really want to be nurses. So we kind of think about all of what we do, and of course we bump into each other because as nurses, a lot of times we learn a little bit about spirituality, a little bit about PTOT, a little bit about speech and language pathology, and learn a little bit about social work. But we're not experts in any of it, right? We're just sort of like doing that. But of course, then we bump over. And I found with our social work colleagues of really trying to help them feel empowered, that they have a big role that they can take on, but they're so worried about the process part of it that they're not sometimes as assertive as we as nurses have kind of learned to be. So we kind of have to help with that. And then just thinking about fairness, this equitable distribution of work, praise and recognition. This is the thing of thinking about your team meeting, of sort of talking about who's gotten honors and awards or what are good things going on rather than all the bad things, and making sure that it's very interdisciplinary of honoring that because different things might mean that. Honesty and then consistency. This is really important, and if you think about parenting, consistency is important too, right? So sometimes I think when you're working with teens, it's a different group of children. Just at a different age, and you've got to kind of think about your consistency is really important. So this is just some of the areas, and you'll see this on the position statement where we've delineated it out. Clinical care, just looking at, thinking about some of the areas of change of practice, evidence-based practice. Management, that we're contributing active to systems changes, that you're recognizing. As nurses, sometimes we are the first people to recognize that things are not going well or that the process doesn't work. So part of leadership is bringing that up to the top to say, yes, we know you spent time and energy, but we missed this little part, and this is a problem. It was interesting, a number of years ago, they were building a new part of the hospital. All the other hospital rooms were doubles. They were going to single. They built this unit that the nurses, particularly this is a problem at night, cannot see the other end of the hallway. It's this figure 8. So if there's an emergency on one side, the other side has no idea. And I'm like, who was not thinking about that? Because that's a problem. But anyway, so the nurses have been trying to do that. Unfortunately, the building was already built, so they can't change that. But thinking about management, how are we mentoring others? How are we thinking about leading committees? Research, even if you're not a researcher, if you're a researcher, that's great, then you're kind of leading the field, then you're teaching others about research. But then if you're not feeling like you're at that level, it's participating. It's kind of thinking about what are the quality improvements. It's helping identify some of the issues that need to be researched. So you don't have to have a PhD to really think about leading in research. There's many ways at different levels. In education, how are we doing education, whether formally or whether we're sort of asking, if different procedures are done, what's the current literature on that? And sometimes in hospice and palliative care, I hear people say, well, this is the way we've always done it. That's a problem. The evidence base doesn't stay concrete like that. It moves. And so we have to help people understand that things will move forward. And then in policy, we've talked a little bit about that, but I think in terms of thinking about access, whatever way we can help people have access, removing disparities, and really thinking about assuring palliative quality. And this is across the spectrum. So when I say palliative care, I'm not leaving out hospice. I'm sort of saying this umbrella of palliative care, of which hospice is the end of life part. So how are we kind of working together and thinking about the whole thing of serious illness? So I liked this quote, you have to be able to lead yourself before you can lead others. So you've got to sometimes think about yourself as a little organizer. And I think about that in terms of my time management and my organizational skills just for myself, let alone doing whatever. But there was a great article in the New York Times that said that people with messy desks are really creative. So that's over my desk. My husband won't come down to my office because he's just like, I don't know how you do what you do. So you've got to kind of think about that. So I think what I would like to think about you is if you haven't kind of gotten the sense that all of you are leaders, so thinking of yourself as a leader, you've got to really think about that, and that there's a way that all of you are helping to lead in palliative nursing. And I said it twice because if you didn't get it the first time, really kind of saying that that's how we do it. Each one of us are doing it one step at a time. And that all the things that we're doing, people will see us as hospice and palliative nurses, and so they will really respond that we are leaders. So, now how are you going to answer this question? You. So, I've given you a whole bunch of references. And you also will have the access to the slides. So I hope is that by the end of this, you'll be able to go home and think about some of these things. And then when we meet next year, you can say, thought about that. And that was really helpful. So comments or questions? Yes.
Connie, one of the things that the senior leadership in our organization is really trying to teach us is this difference or dichotomy of expert versus leader. Mm-hmm. Because I think traditionally we've always thought that to be a leader you have to have 20 years of experience and be the clinical expert, when you might be, but there's also an element of growing new leaders and young leaders who can demonstrate leadership, but maybe they're not the clinical expert yet. Or vice versa. You may have the best clinical expert in your field on your team, and they may not be a leader. And so our leadership team's really trying to think about that as we grow our teammates and think just because maybe they don't have the most experience on our team doesn't mean they're not competent to be in a formal leadership role. So that's a great question, and I think that's one of the things that Julie and I have been kind of working on and thinking about. So if you look at Benner's model of novice to expert, novice is where you're really kind of learning just a little bit about things. Advanced beginner is when you're sort of integrating. By the time you're competent, you should be able to start thinking about leadership skills. The leadership skills that they would take on would be very different than proficient and expert, right? And so at competent, it might just be leading a committee. It might be, starting to think about doing the research to focus a quality indicator. So there's levels that you're right. What the expert does as leadership is going to be different than what the competent does. And so we have to be aware of that in terms of expectations. And the other part of that is, in order to help people be leaders, we've got to help them start thinking that at competent level, they've mastered how to do the care. They can feel good about that. But then they can move beyond their smaller group and go to a larger focus. So I would agree with you that to be an expert is sort of limiting the leadership at your organization. You really want to start it at a level where people are really good clinicians, and so they're looking for things to grow, because in order for us to be sustained, right, we can't just do clinical care all the time. We have to have other things that we're interested, whether it's write an article, lead a group, or something like that. So that's actually part of your sustainability plan, is to start that when they're really kind of gotten certified and at a competent level. Next person had a question.
Just to kind of piggyback a little bit on that, our group, our team, we have a very excellent leader, and one of the activities that she does and she tries to organize once or twice a year is kind of a retreat where we get together. And it was interesting when you were talking about what do you think of yourself, what does your team think of yourself. One of the activities that she put together, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the Johari window, but it was a window that you drew, and there were 4 components to it, but 2 of those components was to write down what you thought other people saw you as, or what you felt their opinion of you was, and then the rest of the group would do the same thing, saying what their opinion was. So you went up and you had your window, and for example, I wrote down what I thought people saw me as, and then they started to say what they saw me as, and it was interesting to see how many different words they came up with. For example, just say the word expert. You talk about the word expert. I did not see myself as that, but so many other people in the group felt that I was an expert. So I think that would help to kind of formulate that part of, what you had talked about in trying to form that leadership and trying to foster that in your team. That's one little exercise that I thought was very helpful in trying to move our team forward and to grow. And it helps with that whole issue of sustainability and resiliency, because you start looking at strengths and weaknesses for other people. You start looking at yourself differently. You start looking at your team members differently. And it really does put you in a different place, a little bit higher level, I think.
And that is really important, because your self-perception, I think all of us kind of limit, well, I'm not really an expert because I haven't done X, Y, and Z. We always make qualifications. Now, I think that's also profession-based, because we would have other professions we work with who are pretty confident, right? And they're sort of taught in a different way to kind of be in a different way. So there's this interesting socialization that we've done within nursing somehow of not kind of thinking of ourselves as that, but that's a really great point. Other comments?
One comment real quickly about our history.
Okay.
And I always add, when I'm talking about Florence Nightingale, I add Walt Whitman into that group. And I don't know if folks know, Walt Whitman was a famous American poet, but he was also a Civil War nurse.
Oh.
And he began that journey by searching for his brother, who had been injured, and was so moved by his visit to the medical facilities in the Civil War that he became a Civil War nurse. And
So we can put him and Clara Barton together.
Yeah, and he talked about the ministry of nursing. And I've often thought about that difference between administrating and ministry. And those two words come from the same root, but they have a little bit different meaning.
But they're both powerful, and they're both leaders.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead.
So there's a leadership model that I just recently heard about called the servant leadership model. And it talks about serving first. And I love that for the language in it as well. I have to explore it a little further. Something that's going on, I work in a very large urban center that has hundreds of beds, thousands of nurses, and they have the shared governance model, and they think that replaces that leadership top down to the bottom. Yet there are so many initiatives going on to reduce readmissions, smooth out transitions, etc. And the nurses that are piloting and pioneering these projects, telehealth being one, aren't able to participate in those shared governance councils because it's not part of the model. And we're not a typical unit per se, or we're not even present on campus. So I like the servant leadership theory, and now of the things that you've introduced to me today, it's just staying open to all of that is, I think, the sign of a great leader as well. So being willing to keep being taught.
Well, and I also would just say this in terms of the self-care and sustainability. We as nurses hold ourselves to this amazingly high standard that every day we're going to be perfect and do it all right. And I think some of it is just giving permission that some days we're going to be on and some days we're going to be off. And as leaders, some days we're going to hit it right and some days we're not. And that's okay. But we've sort of held ourselves to this really amazing standard that it has to be perfect all the time. And that sets us up. The other thing that I was just going to say, pay attention to what you see. And I've noticed this a lot when I listen to the radio a lot. Because I really like to kind of hear in-depth stories. I love storytelling, and if you get other stuff, it's too short. And when you start listening to things, they'll say, well, they talked to X, Y, and I doctors and the nurses. So the nurses, we still are sort of a hidden voice. We don't get named. I was reading a history of a hospice and palliative care organization, and they said, this organization started from this nurse, and she did it for a couple years, and then this doctor, and his name appeared. And I'm like, so the nurse doesn't have a name? She did all this work, and somehow her work wasn't. So pay attention to kind of that, because we do need to give voice and vision to us as nurses and give a face to us so that we can lead. Because if people don't know what we look like or hear our voice, then also, again, we've kind of lost that leadership. Yep.
We've seen that in LMAC trainings, and that's one of the biggest things that we try and emphasize is the empowerment of our profession as nurses. We are at the bedside, we see these patients, we see their families, and using our voices for advocacy and empowerment to say it is important what you have to say.
Yep.
And coming away from that model of getting up from the desk to allow the doctor to sit down.
Yes. Well, and you have some old school hospitals and stuff, so she was saying giving voice to the nurses thing. And, that might be that, really think about if you're doing team rounds and whatever, of how are the nurses presenting? That's leadership too. Are the nurses starting a presentation? How are they presenting? If you're doing, a family meeting, at one point we were having in the ICU that the nurses ran the meeting. Now, what was interesting is that we had house staff say, oh my God, that ICU is really tough. Those nurses have taken over. Really? Well, who knows the patient? The nurses. So doesn't it make sense that they would be leading this meeting? Because they get to see the patients and the families. The patient might be unconscious, but they're hearing the family's conversation. So they can start off the meeting by saying, we're having this meeting. We've heard these conversations that you've had. We thought it was really important to bring to the team. And you just do it like that. That's not taking over the unit. That's just kind of representing the voice. Yeah, somebody else over there. Yeah, Kathy.
So this is kind of not on that topic, but back to your self-care. There's a new, and back to your servant leadership, there's a new term out there called self-compassion. And one of the issues when we've all talked about self-esteem, and what I'm understanding about the difference between self-esteem and self-compassion is self-esteem tends to put us against another person, that I have good self-esteem and I'm good at what I'm doing, and self-compassion recognizes the inadequacies of myself and the inadequacies of you, and I can connect with you. And it's kind of that notion where we can be a servant to another person in that compassion. And so that's just a new term that's coming out that I'm finding very interesting, especially when we talk about eating our young and not being nurturing to each other and how can we do that, and how can we be a leader in that when we're looking at hierarchies in the healthcare system, as and as you said, a physician who really would like to be a nurse, and so how can we recognize that quality in another person in a different way than we've looked at things in the past?
And the last thing I would say to you is, when you think about nursing leadership, look at your organization of where you work. If you're really claiming your nursing leadership, you will have everybody's name and if they're a nurse or not. So I was challenged by somebody to look at CEO nurses who are running hospices. So I did a search. And what was very interesting is they said, well, she's a nurse. On the website, CEO, no mention of their RN. That's a problem to me, because that means that you've let go of your nursing history and your nursing foundation. And then I found a couple that said RN and then whatever the administrative certification is and all that. And so I was having this conversation with somebody. I said, so if you have a nurse leader, they're not going to hide the fact that they're a nurse, and they're really going to embrace that. But when you have that and you don't know in an organization who's a nurse and who's not, because somehow that's not considered high level enough, that's an interesting thing to think about. So go back and look at your organizational listing and look at if credentials are listed next to their name. And if nurses aren't listed, and the different levels of nursing are important too, and whether they're certified, that's who we are. That's what we've accomplished. So why are we not allowed to kind of put that in there? And yet you can pay attention, because there's some places that will say Dr. Black MD. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So you don't know the rest of those are nurses, right? But why does he get to put his MD and the rest don't? So yeah.
So I'm one of those people that you just mentioned that's a CEO, that's a nurse, and I don't put my credentials on my website. And the reason that I do that has nothing to do with the fact that I've moved away from nursing history. I still feel very passionate about how I got here, but I realize in some of the dynamics that I have to leverage my leadership that I have to take the temperature of the audience that I'm speaking with, and sometimes I can leverage that for good, or sometimes I need to leave it under the radar. So I do that specifically and strategically to allow our organization to move forward no matter who it is I'm talking to. So, credentials are important, but they are, you don't have to have a PhD to be a leader. And so I think that there's different dynamics to that, so I wouldn't necessarily put that in a box.
No, I know. I think it was just interesting because then when I read, some of them would say, I started out as a nurse and I became a business leader, and that was mentioned. But then there were others that never mentioned that they'd been a nurse and became a leader. So I just think that's an interesting, like, why does that exist, right? Because that wouldn't exist in medicine. They wouldn't kind of, so I just think we're still dealing with a lot of things about that. And so I'm not saying right or wrong, but it's interesting to note. So I think Chad is standing up here because he's giving me the signal. He hasn't taken me like this yet. So thank you very much for your time and thought for this.